Young man, for the premeditated murder of your brother, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
On March 15, 2022, at 6:47 p.m., an 8-year-old boy lay dead at the bottom of a staircase in Millbrook, Colorado, and the man calling 911 was the county sheriff himself. Marcus Harrington's voice crackled across the radio, breathless and frantic, reporting that his youngest son had fallen down the stairs at their sprawling mountain estate. To the sparse police unit scattered across the wealthy enclave outside Aspen, the Harrington address was all too familiar. A pristine 5-acre property with panoramic views of the Rockies, the kind of home that represented the American dream achieved through years of public service. But as the last rays of sunlight painted the snow-capped peaks crimson and gold that March evening, investigators would discover that this was no tragic accident. What happened inside that dream home would shatter multiple families and expose the rot festering beneath Millbrook's picture-perfect surface. Before we continue, subscribe to our channel to follow this devastating case to its conclusion, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we examine how a family's darkest secrets can hide behind a badge and a white picket fence. This story will take you inside a tragedy that asks uncomfortable questions about parental responsibility, mental health, and the justice system's treatment of children who kill. Now let's return to that fateful evening when the facade finally crumbled. Paramedic Sarah Jennings was the first medical professional through the door of the Harrington home, her boots pounding across the hardwood floors as she followed Sheriff Harrington's gestures toward the base of the grand staircase. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her career. 8-year-old Ethan Thompson lay crumpled at an impossible angle, his small body surrounded by a pool of blood that had already begun to congeal in the cool air of the foyer. The child's skull showed obvious trauma, but it was the other injuries that immediately caught Jennings's trained eye. Defensive wounds on his forearms, bruising that suggested he'd been struck multiple times, and a pattern of blood spatter on the wall that seemed inconsistent with a simple tumble down the stairs. Sheriff Harrington hovered nearby, his uniform still crisp, despite the horror of the scene, repeating the same story over and over. Ethan had been playing upstairs, there was a crash, and when he rushed to investigate, he found his son at the bottom of the stairs. The arrival of State Police Detective Reginald Torres 20 minutes later fundamentally altered the trajectory of the investigation. Torres, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for methodical crime scene analysis, had been dining with his family at a restaurant in Aspen proper when the call came through about an officer-involved incident requiring state oversight. He walked into the Harrington home with the careful, measured steps of a man who knew that first impressions of a crime scene could make or break a case, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the opulent entryway with its vaulted ceilings and original artwork. Sheriff Harrington immediately tried to assert control, explaining that this was clearly an accident and didn't require the heavy hand of state investigation, but Torres calmly informed him that any death involving a law enforcement officer's family would be handled by an independent team. The tension between the two men was palpable, a clash of jurisdictions and egos playing out, while a child's body grew cold on the expensive Italian tile. The forensic team that descended on the Millbrook property transformed the pristine home into a grid of evidence markers and camera flashes. Lead crime scene investigator Patricia Mendez directed her team with quiet efficiency, photographing blood spatter patterns that told a story wildly different from the one Sheriff Harrington was selling. The blood on the wall showed a cast-off pattern consistent with an object being swung repeatedly, not the splash pattern expected from a body tumbling downstairs. Ethan's defensive wounds, scrapes and bruises on his forearms and hands, suggested he had tried to protect himself from an attack, raising his arms to ward off blows from someone standing over him. Most tellingly, the position of the body seemed staged, arranged too neatly at the base of the stairs rather than sprawled in the chaotic aftermath of a fall. Detective Torres stood to the side, watching Sheriff Harrington's face as each new piece of evidence emerged, noting how the man's jaw tightened and his hands clenched whenever Mendez made a notation that contradicted the accident narrative. As the evening wore into night and portable lights were set up to illuminate the scene, a state police officer discovered something clutched in Ethan's small fist. The child's fingers were curled around several green fibers, gripping them with the desperate strength of someone fighting for their life. Detective Torres carefully photographed the evidence before it was bagged, his mind already racing through the implications. If Ethan had grabbed onto his attacker, those fibers could be the key to identifying who had actually killed him. The Harrington family members were separated and placed in different rooms of the house for preliminary questioning, a standard procedure that Sheriff Harrington protested loudly until Torres reminded him that he was now a witness, not an investigator. In the living room, 13-year-old Lucas Lopez sat on a leather sofa, his distinctive green hoodie draped over the back of a chair, seemingly oblivious to the significance of his clothing choice. His mother, Jacqueline Harrington, sat beside him with red-rimmed eyes, occasionally reaching out to touch her surviving son's shoulder, as if to confirm he was still there. The initial interviews revealed troubling inconsistencies that transformed the investigation from a potential accident review into an active homicide case. Sheriff Harrington insisted he'd been in his home office working on reports when he heard the crash, but his teenage daughter told investigators she'd seen her father in the garage around that time. Jacqueline Harrington's timeline for when she last saw Ethan alive shifted multiple times during questioning, first saying it was 6:30 p.m., then 6:15 p.m., then admitting she wasn't entirely sure. Lucas Lopez, when asked what he'd been doing that evening, stated flatly that he'd been in his room playing video games, never leaving, except to use the bathroom around 6 p.m. Detective Torres noted that the boy showed no emotion when discussing his dead brother, no tears or shock, just a blank affect that could indicate either severe trauma or something far more sinister. The pieces weren't fitting together, and as Torres looked around at this wealthy family in their million-dollar home, he knew that the real story was buried beneath layers of secrets and lies. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment, delivered to Detective Torres at 11:00 p.m. that night, confirmed his darkest suspicions. Dr. Raymond Chen, speaking in the precise language of forensic pathology, explained that Ethan Thompson had suffered blunt force trauma from at least 3 separate impacts, with the fatal blow striking the back of his skull while he was in a kneeling position. The injury pattern was inconsistent with a fall downstairs, which typically produced different types of trauma distributed across multiple body surfaces. Dr. Chen pointed to contusions on Ethan's back and shoulders that suggested he'd been struck from behind, possibly while trying to crawl away from his attacker. The time of death was estimated between 6:15 p.m. and 6:45 p.m., a window that encompassed the sheriff's 911 call, but also raised questions about how long Ethan had lain dying before help was summoned. Torres thanked the medical examiner and walked back into the Harrington home, where the family still waited in separate rooms, none of them yet aware that this was no longer being treated as an accident. The decision to focus on Lucas Lopez as a potential suspect came not from intuition, but from methodical analysis of the physical evidence. The green fibers found in Ethan's hand were rushed to the state crime lab, where textile analysts determined they matched the specific blend of cotton and polyester used in a particular brand of athletic hoodie. That same hoodie was photographed on the back of the living room chair, its distinctive forest green color and brand logo clearly visible in the evidence photos. When investigators examined Lucas's sneakers, size 7 Nike high tops with a distinctive tread pattern, They found a partial bloody footprint near Ethan's body that appeared to match. The constellation of physical evidence was beginning to point in a direction that Detective Torres found both tragic and infuriating. Toward a 13-year-old boy who had apparently killed his younger brother in this affluent Colorado home. While their law enforcement father worked just rooms away, the detective knew he needed more than physical evidence, though. He needed to understand what could drive a child to commit such violence. The Harrington family's public image had always been one of wholesome American values and community service. Sheriff Marcus Harrington was a fixture at town council meetings, youth sports events, and church services, always ready with a firm handshake and a reassuring word about public safety. Jacqueline Harrington ran a popular mommy blog called Mountain Mama Musings, where she shared parenting tips, family recipes, and inspirational quotes against a backdrop of carefully curated photos showing her photogenic family hiking, skiing, and enjoying quality time together. The family's Christmas cards were legendary in Millbrook, professional photos of the Harringtons in matching outfits against stunning Rocky Mountain backdrops sent to everyone from local business owners to state politicians. But as Detective Torres began pulling at the threads of this perfect family tapestry, he discovered that the image was a carefully constructed lie designed to hide dysfunction, violence, and a child spiraling toward catastrophe while the adults around him looked the other way or actively profited from his suffering. Detective Reginald Torres's formal assumption of command over the crime scene marked a critical turning point in the investigation, one that Sheriff Marcus Harrington fought with every ounce of his professional and political capital. The sheriff placed calls to the county commissioner, the mayor of Aspen, and even a state senator, all of whom he'd cultivated relationships with over his 18-year career in law enforcement. But Torres had the full backing of the state police superintendent, who understood that any death in a law enforcement family required not just independent oversight, but the appearance of absolute impartiality to maintain public trust. By 2 a.m. on March 16, 2022, Sheriff Harrington was officially relieved of any role in the investigation, forced to sit in his own home as state police methodically dismantled the narrative he'd tried to construct. The forensic analysis of the blood spatter patterns proved to be the first major break in unraveling the truth behind Ethan Thompson's death. Patricia Mendez, the lead crime scene investigator, spent hours documenting the distribution and characteristics of blood throughout the foyer and staircase area. The pattern on the wall showed elongated droplets consistent with cast-off spatter, the kind created when blood is flung from an object in motion, like a weapon being swung repeatedly. The angle and distribution of these droplets told Mendez that the person wielding the weapon had been standing over the victim, bringing the object down in overhead strikes rather than horizontal swings. Mathematical analysis of the blood spatter allowed Mendez to triangulate the position of both attacker and victim with remarkable precision. Ethan had been on his knees, possibly begging or trying to protect himself, while his killer stood behind and above him. This wasn't the chaotic tumble of a child falling downstairs. This was an execution dressed up to look like an accident. The defensive wounds on Ethan's body painted an even more heartbreaking picture of his final moments. Dr. Raymond Chen's detailed autopsy revealed that the 8-year-old had sustained injuries to his hands and forearms, consistent with trying to ward off blows from above. There were bruises in the pattern of small fingers on Ethan's shoulders, suggesting someone had grabbed him and held him in place. A closer examination of the child's knees revealed carpet fibers and minor abrasions that supported the theory he'd been forced into a kneeling position before the fatal blow was struck. Dr. Chen noted in his report that one of the defensive injuries, a deep bruise on Ethan's right forearm, matched the diameter of the tactical flashlight that every Aspen County Sheriff's deputy carried on their duty belt. The weapon was heavy enough to deliver lethal force, small enough to be wielded by a teenager, and significantly, Sheriff Harrington's flashlight was missing from his duty belt when investigators asked to examine his equipment. The green fibers clutched in Ethan's hand became the subject of intense scrutiny at the State Crime Lab in Denver. Textile analyst Dr. Samantha Wells placed the fibers under a comparison microscope alongside samples cut from Lucas Lopez's hoodie, examining them at magnifications up to 400x. The fibers matched in every observable characteristic: color, diameter, cross-sectional shape, and the specific ratio of cotton to synthetic materials. Dr. Wells also identified a distinctive irregularity in the weave pattern, a slight imperfection that occurred during manufacturing, which appeared in both the evidence fibers and the hoodie samples. The statistical probability of these fibers coming from a different garment was calculated at less than 1 in 50,000. When combined with the fact that Lucas owned and had been wearing a hoodie of this exact description on the day of the murder, the fiber evidence became nearly irrefutable proof that Ethan had grabbed onto his older brother during the attack, desperate for mercy that never came. The bloody footprint discovered near Ethan's body provided another crucial piece of the forensic puzzle. Shoe print analyst Mark Richardson photographed and measured the partial print, which showed the distinctive waffle pattern of a Nike high-top sneaker in size 7. The print had been made in Ethan's blood, meaning the person who left it had stepped in the pooled blood after the fatal injuries were inflicted. Richardson compared the evidence print to exemplars taken from every member of the Harrington household, and only one pair matched: the Nike high tops that Lucas had kicked off in the mudroom. The pattern of wear on Lucas's sneakers matched the evidence print perfectly, including a small defect in the tread where a piece of rubber had torn away from the sole. This wasn't just a general match to a common shoe type. It was a specific, individualized match to one particular pair of sneakers worn by one particular person on the night Ethan Thompson was murdered. Detective Torres knew that physical evidence alone, while compelling, wouldn't fully explain why a 13-year-old boy would kill his younger brother. The answer to that question lay in Lucas's digital footprint, and Torres obtained a warrant to seize all electronic devices in the Harrington home. Lucas's smartphone was turned over to digital forensics specialist Angela Ramirez, who discovered that the boy had attempted to delete his search history on the evening of March 12, 2022, exactly 3 days before Ethan's death. Using forensic recovery software, Ramirez was able to resurrect the deleted searches, which read like a how-to guide for getting away with murder. The searches included how to make murder look like accident, can a kid go to jail for killing brother, how long does DNA last, and do stairs kill people. The timing and content of these searches demonstrated premeditation, transforming Lucas from a troubled child who'd acted impulsively into someone who had planned his brother's death with chilling calculation. The confrontation between Detective Torres and Sheriff Harrington in the early hours of March 16, 2022, revealed the depth of the sheriff's desperation to control the narrative. Harrington demanded to know why state police were treating his family tragedy like a crime scene, why his son's body had been taken to Denver for autopsy rather than handled locally, why his home was still crawling with investigators when the accident was so obviously explained. Torres calmly presented the evidence: the blood spatter analysis, the fiber match, the footprint, the deleted searches. He watched the sheriff's face transform from indignation to shock to something that looked almost like resignation. Harrington asked if he could speak with his son alone to help him process the trauma of losing his brother. Torres denied the request, explaining that Lucas was now the primary suspect in a homicide investigation, and that any contact between family members would need to be monitored. The sheriff's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, and he sank into a chair, his head in his hands, muttering that this couldn't be happening to his family. Jacqueline Harrington's reaction to the mounting evidence against her son was markedly different from her husband's. When Torres informed her that Lucas was being considered a suspect rather than a grieving sibling, she immediately demanded a lawyer and refused to answer any further questions. Her social media accounts, which had been public-facing platforms for her Mountain Mama Musings brand, were swiftly set to private. The carefully curated photos of her happy family vanished from public view, replaced by a terse statement expressing grief over Ethan's passing and requesting privacy during this difficult time. But investigators had already archived her entire digital presence, and what they found in her blog posts and social media updates painted a disturbing picture of a mother who had recognized her older son's escalating violence, but had chosen to monetize his struggles rather than get him proper help. Torres assigned an investigator specifically to analyze Jacqueline's online presence, sensing that the family's public image was about to provide critical context for understanding how tragedy had been allowed to fester behind closed doors. The size 7 Nike footprint took on additional significance when investigators reconstructed the timeline of events. Based on the blood spatter patterns and the position of the footprint relative to Ethan's body, forensic analysts determined that the bloody print had been made after the fatal blow was struck. This suggested that Lucas had stood over his brother's dying body, possibly watching to ensure Ethan was dead before leaving the scene. The coldness of that act, combined with the premeditation shown by the deleted searches, began to paint a picture of a deeply disturbed adolescent whose capacity for violence had been steadily escalating. Detective Torres knew from experience that children didn't usually commit premeditated murder without warning signs, which meant someone in Ethan's life had likely seen this coming and failed to intervene. The question was whether that failure constituted criminal negligence or something even worse. The tactical flashlight that had likely served as the murder weapon was discovered in a trash can behind a shopping center 2 miles from the Harrington home. A sanitation worker had noticed it while emptying the dumpster on the morning of March 16th, recognizing it as law enforcement equipment, and turning it over to the Aspen Police Department. When state investigators tested the flashlight for blood evidence, they found trace amounts of Ethan's blood in the grooves of the handle and around the bezel. The flashlight's serial number matched the department-issued equipment assigned to Sheriff Marcus Harrington, though fingerprint analysis revealed that the last person to handle it had been Lucas Lopez. This discovery raised troubling questions about how a 13-year-old had accessed his father's duty equipment and whether Sheriff Harrington had been aware that his son had taken the weapon. The flashlight also explained the specific pattern of injuries on Ethan's skull. The heavy rubberized body of the tactical light had essentially functioned as a club, delivering devastating force with each impact. As dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains on March 16, 2022, the Harrington home remained an active crime scene, surrounded by yellow tape and state police vehicles. Neighbors in the affluent Millbrook community gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones about the tragedy that had shattered their sense of security. Several of them told investigators that they'd noticed tension in the Harrington family, that Lucas had seemed troubled and withdrawn in recent months, that there had been loud arguments audible from the street on several occasions. One neighbor reported calling Child Protective Services the previous summer after witnessing Sheriff Harrington violently disciplining Lucas in the front yard, but the complaint had been closed without action after the sheriff claimed he'd simply been restraining his son during a mental health episode. These revelations painted a picture of a community that had seen warning signs but had been reluctant to challenge a law enforcement family's authority, allowing dysfunction to escalate until it ended in murder. The forensic analysis of Lucas Lopez's green hoodie transformed it from a simple piece of clothing into one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case. When textile expert Dr. Samantha Wells examined the garment under specialized lighting, she discovered microscopic blood spatter on the sleeves and front panel that was invisible to the naked eye. DNA analysis confirmed this blood belonged to Ethan Thompson, and the distribution pattern was consistent with being in close proximity to the victim during a violent attack. The spatter was classified as impact spatter, created when blood breaks into small droplets due to the force of a blow, exactly what would occur if Lucas had been standing over Ethan while repeatedly striking him with a tactical flashlight. Most significantly, the hoodie showed evidence of having been laundered after the murder, with chemical analysis detecting trace amounts of bleach in areas where blood spatter was found, suggesting Lucas had attempted to destroy evidence before investigators could collect the garment. The size 7 Nike sneakers removed from Lucas's feet on the night of the murder underwent exhaustive testing at the State Crime Lab. Beyond the tread pattern matched to the bloody footprint, analysts discovered additional blood evidence in the grooves and crevices of the sole, concentrated in areas where casual cleaning might miss. DNA testing confirmed this blood was Ethan's, and the distribution pattern indicated Lucas had walked through a significant pool of blood, consistent with standing over his brother's body after the fatal blows. The sneakers also contained trace amounts of carpet fiber from the upstairs hallway where the attack was believed to have begun, as well as fibers from the living room carpet where Ethan's body had been found. This fiber transfer evidence allowed investigators to track Lucas's movements through the crime scene, painting a picture of the pursuit and attack that ended in fratricide. The shoes themselves became silent witnesses to a brother's final moments, their every stain and fiber telling a story of violence and betrayal. The deleted internet searches on Lucas's smartphone proved to be a goldmine of evidence demonstrating premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Digital forensics specialist Angela Ramirez recovered not just the searches themselves, but the timestamps, revealing that Lucas had spent nearly 45 minutes on March 12, 2022, researching how to commit and cover up a murder. He'd visited forums where people discussed unsolved crimes, read articles about forensic science and crime scene investigation, and watched YouTube videos explaining how blood spatter analysis worked. The sophistication of his research suggested a teenager who understood exactly what he was planning and had taken steps to educate himself about avoiding detection. Ramirez also recovered deleted text messages between Lucas and a friend in which he'd complained about Ethan ruining everything and stated that he wished his younger brother would just disappear. While the friend had apparently dismissed these comments as typical sibling rivalry, they now took on sinister new meaning in light of Ethan's death. Detective Torres arranged for Lucas to be formally interviewed on March 17, 2022, with his court-appointed attorney present and with the session being video recorded. The interrogation room at the state police headquarters in Aspen was deliberately designed to be psychologically oppressive, windowless, with institutional gray walls and furniture bolted to the floor. Torres began with gentle questions about Lucas's relationship with his brother, allowing the boy to establish a baseline of responses before confronting him with the evidence. Lucas initially maintained that he loved his brother and had been devastated by the accident, his affect flat, and his answers delivered in a monotone that suggested either severe trauma or practiced deception. But when Torres produced photographs of the green hoodie fibers found in Ethan's hand, Lucas's composure began to crack, his breathing quickening, and his hands fidgeting with the zipper of the jail-issued jumpsuit he now wore. The turning point in the interrogation came when Detective Torres presented the evidence of the deleted internet searches. Lucas's attorney immediately advised him not to answer any questions about his phone usage, but the damage was done. The boy's face had gone pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he realized how thoroughly his attempted cover-up had failed. Torres methodically laid out the forensic evidence: the fiber match, the bloody footprint, the blood on the hoodie and shoes, the searches about making murder look like an accident. Each piece of evidence was presented with calm professionalism, not as an accusation, but as an invitation for Lucas to explain how all this evidence could possibly point to anyone but him. The teenager's lawyer called for a break, and during that 30-minute intermission, Lucas apparently decided that denying the obvious was futile. When they resumed, he asked if he could speak with just Detective Torres. Alone, and after his attorney reluctantly agreed, Lucas confessed. The confession that Lucas Lopez gave to Detective Torres on March 17, 2022, was both heartbreaking and horrifying in its matter-of-fact recitation of fratricide. Lucas explained that on March 15th he'd been playing on his custom gaming console when Ethan had come into his room asking to play too. Lucas had told him no, that he was in the middle of an important online match, but Ethan had persisted, grabbing at the controller. In the ensuing struggle, Ethan had knocked the console off the desk, sending it crashing to the floor where the hard drive was damaged beyond repair. Lucas described feeling a red fog descending over his vision, an uncontrollable rage that he'd experienced before when his intermittent explosive disorder symptoms were at their worst. He'd grabbed the tactical flashlight from his father's duty belt, which he'd taken earlier that day, and followed Ethan into the hallway. What happened next was described in chilling detail. Lucas had struck Ethan from behind, knocking him to the floor, then forced his younger brother to his knees before delivering the fatal blows. The psychological dimensions of Lucas's confession revealed the toxic influence of his father's example on his developing moral framework. Lucas told Detective Torres that he hadn't really thought of what he was doing as murder. In his mind, he was disciplining Ethan for destroying his property, the same way Sheriff Harrington had disciplined him countless times with physical violence. He'd watched his father solve problems through intimidation and force, whether it was with suspects, with community members who challenged his authority, or with his own family when they stepped out of line. In Lucas's fractured understanding, violence wasn't murder. It was problem-solving. The tactical flashlight itself had symbolic significance. Lucas had specifically chosen his father's weapon, perhaps unconsciously seeking to emulate the man he both feared and sought to please. This revelation suggested that Lucas's crime wasn't just an isolated act of violence, but the inevitable outcome of growing up in a household where brutality was normalized and modeled by the person who was supposed to protect him. Lucas also revealed during his confession that he'd been off his antipsychotic medication for intermittent explosive disorder for approximately 6 months before the murder. His parents had discontinued his prescription after his father's health insurance changed, making the medication prohibitively expensive at over $800 per month. Lucas described how his anger had become progressively harder to control, how he'd experienced violent fantasies about hurting people who annoyed him, and how he'd started harming animals as an outlet for his rage. His mother had known about the medication lapse, Lucas explained, and had promised to find a cheaper alternative, but she'd been too busy with her blog to follow through. The neglect was both medical and moral. Lucas's parents had recognized he was deteriorating, but had chosen to prioritize financial concerns and public image over their son's mental health treatment. This context didn't excuse Lucas's crime, but it raised serious questions about whether his parents bore criminal responsibility for creating the conditions that made murder possible. The part of Lucas's confession that most troubled Detective Torres was the boy's description of his emotional state after killing Ethan. Lucas explained that after delivering the fatal blow, he'd stood over his brother's body and felt nothing. no remorse, no horror, just a practical concern about how to make the death look accidental. He'd dragged Ethan's body to the top of the stairs, positioned it, and then pushed it down to the landing, attempting to create the appearance of a fall. But the body hadn't landed correctly, and Lucas had panicked, realizing his staging attempt was obvious. He'd gone to find his father, planning to confess. But when Sheriff Harrington saw Ethan's body, he'd immediately started constructing the accident narrative, telling Lucas to go to his room and let him handle everything. Lucas's confession implicated not just himself, but his father, in an attempted cover-up, suggesting that Sheriff Harrington had recognized his son as the killer and had chosen to protect him rather than seek justice for Ethan. The revelation that Sheriff Marcus Harrington had potentially helped stage the crime scene sent shockwaves through the state police investigation. Detective Torres immediately obtained a warrant to seize all of the sheriff's personal and professional communications, looking for evidence that he'd known Lucas was responsible and had actively worked to cover it up. The sheriff's behavior on the night of the murder took on new significance. His insistence that state police weren't needed, his attempts to control who had access to the scene, his specific narrative about Ethan falling down the stairs. Text messages recovered from the sheriff's phone showed that he'd called his personal attorney before calling 911, a decision that suggested he knew this wasn't a simple accident. Torres also discovered that Sheriff Harrington had deleted his own text exchanges with Lucas from the evening of the murder, though forensic analysis of the phone recovered fragments showing the sheriff had texted his son with cleanup advice shortly before calling emergency services. The 6-hour interrogation of Lucas Lopez concluded with the teenager being formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Ethan Thompson. Despite his age, Colorado law allowed for juveniles as young as 12 to be charged as adults for serious felonies, and prosecutors determined that the premeditation evidenced by the deleted searches warranted adult prosecution. Lucas was transported to a juvenile detention facility in Denver to await trial, his life as a free person, effectively over before his 14th birthday. As Detective Torres watched the boy being led away in shackles, he felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction at solving the case and sorrow at the waste of multiple young lives. Ethan Thompson would never grow up, never graduate from school, never experience first love, or build a career, or have children of his own. And Lucas Lopez, barring a miracle, would spend the rest of his life in prison, his adolescence and adulthood consumed by concrete walls and razor wire. The fiber evidence from Ethan's clenched fist became a powerful symbol during the development of the case for trial. Prosecutor Nora Hughes, assigned to try the case in Aspen, Colorado, saw those green fibers as physical proof of Ethan's desperate final struggle for survival. She envisioned showing enlarged photographs to the jury, asking them to imagine an 8-year-old boy grabbing at his brother's clothes, begging for mercy that never came. The fibers represented not just scientific evidence, but human tragedy, a child's last act of resistance preserved in the very fabric that had clothed his killer. Hughes knew that jurors would be predisposed to sympathy for a 13-year-old defendant, might struggle with the concept of charging a child with adult murder, but those fibers would force them to confront the reality of what Lucas had done. Ethan Thompson had fought for his life, and the physical evidence proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. The state police investigation into the Harrington family's history uncovered a pattern of escalating violence that Sheriff Marcus Harrington had systematically covered up using his position and connections. Detective Torres assigned a team to canvass Millbrook and surrounding communities, interviewing neighbors, teachers, and anyone who had interacted with Lucas Lopez over the previous 2 years. What emerged was a portrait of a deeply troubled adolescent whose warning signs had been ignored, suppressed, or explained away by parents more concerned with maintaining their public image than protecting their children or community. The first major revelation came from Jennifer Martinez, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down from the Harringtons, who reported that in August 2021, she had witnessed Lucas torturing her family's dog in the wooded area behind their properties. Martinez had found Lucas holding her golden retriever down while burning the dog's paws with cigarette lighters, laughing as the animal yelped in pain. She'd immediately called the sheriff's department. But when deputies arrived, Sheriff Harrington had taken over the call, dismissed his subordinates, and told Martinez that Lucas was experiencing a mental health episode and would be getting treatment. The dog torture incident should have resulted in charges of animal cruelty and a psychological evaluation, but Sheriff Harrington had used his authority to ensure the report disappeared. Detective Torres obtained internal sheriff's department records showing that the incident had been logged as a welfare check, no action needed, rather than as a criminal complaint. No report had been filed with animal control, no investigation had been conducted, and Jennifer Martinez had been told that pursuing the matter would only traumatize a mentally ill child who couldn't control his actions. Martinez told investigators that she'd been intimidated into silence by the sheriff's reputation and his implied suggestion that making trouble for his family could result in slower response times when she needed police assistance. The deliberate suppression of this incident demonstrated that Sheriff Harrington had been aware of his son's capacity for violence and had chosen to protect Lucas rather than address his escalating pathology. The second incident uncovered by investigators was even more serious and had occurred in October 2021 at Millbrook Middle School. Lucas had gotten into a dispute with a classmate named Derek Wilson during lunch period, and when Derek had made fun of Lucas's clothes, Lucas had responded by smashing Derek's head into a cafeteria table repeatedly until other students pulled him off. Derek had suffered a severe concussion, fractured cheekbone, and required 18 stitches to close a gash across his forehead. School officials had called the sheriff's department to file assault charges, but once again, Sheriff Harrington had intervened. He'd met with the school principal and Derek's parents, offering to pay all medical expenses and ensure Lucas received intensive therapy if they agreed not to press charges. The Wilson family, intimidated by the sheriff's position and worried about retaliation, had reluctantly agreed, and Lucas had been suspended for just 10 days before returning to school. Detective Torres interviewed Derek's parents, who expressed guilt and anger that their decision to let the matter drop had potentially contributed to Ethan's death. The third suppressed incident was perhaps the most chilling and had occurred in December 2021, just 3 months before Ethan's murder. Jacqueline Harrington had called 911 in a panic, reporting that Lucas had threatened to kill her during an argument about his refusal to do homework. When deputies arrived, they found Jacqueline locked in the master bedroom, with Lucas pounding on the door and screaming death threats. The responding officers had documented the incident and recommended that Lucas be placed on a psychiatric hold for evaluation, but Sheriff Harrington had arrived on scene and once again shut down the investigation. He'd explained to his deputies that Lucas had stopped taking his medication due to insurance issues and that the family was working with a private psychiatrist to find alternatives. The deputies had reluctantly accepted their boss's explanation, and the incident was recorded as a domestic disturbance resolved by family. Investigators obtained the original incident report that the deputies had written before the sheriff's intervention, which included one deputy's notation that this kid is going to kill someone if he doesn't get help. The pattern of suppression revealed by these 3 incidents was clear. Sheriff Marcus Harrington had recognized that his son was dangerous, had witnessed Lucas's escalating violence firsthand, but had repeatedly chosen to use his authority to protect Lucas from consequences rather than get him proper treatment or remove him from situations where he could harm others. Detective Torres met with the district attorney's office to discuss additional charges against the sheriff. After reviewing the evidence, prosecutors determined that Harrington could be charged with obstruction of justice for suppressing the dog torture and school assault incidents, as well as child endangerment for failing to seek appropriate mental health treatment for Lucas, despite knowing he was a threat to himself and others. On March 23, 2022, Sheriff Marcus Harrington was arrested at his home by the same state police officers he'd tried to keep out of his investigation, his law enforcement career ending in handcuffs and a perp walk captured by every news outlet in Colorado. The arrest of Sheriff Harrington transformed the case from a tragic family murder into a broader indictment of systemic failure and abuse of power. News outlets across the country picked up the story, focusing on the shocking image of a uniformed sheriff being led into court in shackles to face charges stemming from his son's murder of his other son. Legal analysts debated whether Harrington's actions rose to the level of criminal negligence, or if he was simply a father who'd made tragically bad decisions while trying to protect his troubled child. But for the residents of Millbrook and the broader Aspen community, the sheriff's arrest confirmed their worst suspicions about the corruption that could fester when law enforcement operated without oversight. Several victims of Lucas's previous violence came forward to the media, expressing rage that the sheriff had prioritized his family's reputation over public safety, potentially preventing intervention that could have saved Ethan's life. The psychological evaluation ordered for Lucas as part of his pretrial proceedings provided crucial insight into how an untreated mental illness combined with learned violence had created a child capable of murder. Dr. Elizabeth Tran, a forensic psychologist specializing in juvenile offenders, spent 12 hours interviewing Lucas over multiple sessions. Her report, filed with the court, diagnosed Lucas with intermittent explosive disorder, conduct disorder, and emerging antisocial personality traits. Dr. Tran noted that Lucas showed minimal remorse for killing Ethan, viewing his brother's death primarily through the lens of how it had disrupted his own life, rather than as a moral wrong. The psychologist documented that Lucas had been socialized into viewing violence as an appropriate response to frustration by witnessing his father's behavior, and that discontinuing his antipsychotic medication had removed the chemical brake on his explosive rage. Most disturbingly, Dr. Tran concluded that Lucas posed a high risk for future violence and would require intensive, long-term treatment in a secure setting to ever be safely released into the community. The revelation about Lucas's discontinued medication became a central focus of the state's case against both Lucas and his father. Medical records obtained from Lucas's psychiatrist showed that the boy had been prescribed a combination of antipsychotic and mood-stabilizing medications starting in February 2021, following a series of violent outbursts at school and home. The medications had been effective in reducing Lucas's aggressive episodes, and his psychiatrist had noted significant improvement in his behavior and emotional regulation. But when Sheriff Harrington's employer switched insurance providers in September 2021, the new plan didn't cover the specific medications Lucas was taking, and the out-of-pocket cost would have been approximately $800 per month. Rather than finding alternative medications or paying the cost, Jacqueline and Marcus Harrington had simply stopped filling Lucas's prescriptions, telling the psychiatrist they were seeking treatment through a different provider. The psychiatrist had sent multiple letters warning that abruptly discontinuing the medications could lead to severe consequences, but the Harringtons had never responded. The financial decision to stop Lucas's medication took on even darker implications when investigators examined Jacqueline Harrington's blog, Income. Her Mountain Mama Musings platform had grown into a lucrative business with sponsorship deals, affiliate marketing, and premium subscription content, generating an estimated $6,000 to $8,000 per month. Jacqueline had been earning more than enough to cover Lucas's medication costs while still maintaining the family's affluent lifestyle. But as Detective Torres dug deeper into her blog archives, he discovered something that would become a bombshell revelation at trial. Jacqueline had been writing extensively about her struggles, parenting a troubled teen, and monetizing Lucas's mental health crisis. She'd created a series of sponsored posts about dealing with difficult children, sold an ebook titled When Love Isn't Enough, Parenting the Impossible Child, and charged subscribers $25 per month for access to detailed journals about Lucas's behavioral problems. Jacqueline Harrington had literally been profiting from her son's deteriorating mental health while refusing to pay for the medication that could have prevented his descent into murder. The discovery of Jacqueline's blog exploitation led to additional charges being filed against her. While prosecutors couldn't directly charge her with causing Ethan's death, they could pursue charges of child abuse and neglect for failing to provide necessary medical care to Lucas, as well as exploitation of a minor for using Lucas's mental illness for financial gain without his consent. The blog posts themselves were damning, with Jacqueline describing Lucas's violent outbursts in graphic detail, sharing photos of damage he'd caused during rages, and positioning herself as a martyred mother coping with an unmanageable child. What was never mentioned in any of her posts was that she'd stopped his medication, that his psychiatrist was begging her to seek emergency intervention, or that multiple incidents of serious violence had been covered up by her husband. Jacqueline Harrington's carefully curated online persona as Mountain Mama was revealed to be a grotesque performance, a mother profiting from her child's suffering while ensuring that suffering would continue to provide content for her lucrative platform. The charging decisions for all three members of the Harrington family created a legal situation unprecedented in Colorado history. Lucas Lopez faced first-degree murder charges as an adult, potentially resulting in a sentence of life without parole despite his age at the time of the offense. Sheriff Marcus Harrington faced charges of obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and abuse of public office. Jacqueline Harrington faced charges of child abuse, neglect, and exploitation of a minor. The cases would all proceed separately, but they were inextricably linked by the central tragedy of Ethan Thompson's murder and the systematic failures that had made that murder possible. Prosecutor Nora Hughes knew that the cases against the parents would be complex and possibly controversial, but she was determined to hold all responsible parties accountable for their roles in creating the conditions that led to an 8-year-old boy being bludgeoned to death by his older brother. The formal arrest of Sheriff Marcus Harrington on March 23, 2022, marked the beginning of a parallel investigation into how he had systematically abused his position to cover up his son's escalating violence. Detective Torres worked with internal affairs investigators from the Colorado State Police to examine every aspect of Harrington's 18-year career, looking for patterns of misconduct, intimidation, and official corruption. What they discovered painted a picture of a law enforcement officer who had increasingly seen himself as above the law, using his badge and authority to protect himself and his family from consequences. The investigation revealed that Harrington had quashed at least 7 traffic citations for family members, had failed to file reports on 3 domestic disturbance calls at his own home prior to the murder, and had actively intimidated witnesses to his son's violence by implying that making official complaints could result in professional or personal retaliation. The dog torture incident from August 2021 became the centerpiece of the obstruction of justice case against Sheriff Harrington. Prosecutors obtained statements from the deputies who had initially responded to Jennifer Martinez's call, both of whom confirmed that they had wanted to file animal cruelty charges against Lucas, but had been ordered by their sheriff to stand down and delete their preliminary reports. One deputy, Thomas Brennan, testified that Sheriff Harrington had explicitly told him that cops take care of their own, and that filing charges against a fellow officer's son would be seen as a betrayal of the thin blue line. Brennan had reluctantly complied, but he kept his own notes of the incident, which he now turned over to investigators. Those notes described finding Jennifer Martinez's dog with severe burns on its paws, Lucas holding cigarette lighters and laughing, and the dog's obvious terror when Lucas approached it. The notes also documented Sheriff Harrington's arrival on scene and his immediate move to control the narrative, telling the deputies that Lucas had a mental illness and couldn't be held responsible for his actions. The school assault incident from October 2021 provided even more damning evidence of Sheriff Harrington's pattern of obstruction. Detective Torres interviewed the principal of Millbrook Middle School, Dr. Patricia Green, who explained that school policy required reporting violent assaults to law enforcement for potential prosecution. She'd made the call to the sheriff's department following Lucas's attack on Derek Wilson, expecting that the normal juvenile justice protocols would be followed. Instead, Sheriff Harrington had arrived at the school in full uniform and demanded a meeting with Dr. Green in private. During that meeting, according to Green's contemporaneous notes, the sheriff had explicitly threatened that if charges were filed against Lucas, he would make life difficult for the school by increasing DUI checkpoints near school events, enforcing noise ordinances during football games, and finding code violations in school facilities. Green had caved to the pressure, agreeing to handle the incident internally, but she'd documented the threats in a memo to the school district's legal counsel. The Derek Wilson assault also revealed the financial inducements Sheriff Harrington had used to buy silence. Derek's parents, Mark and Susan Wilson, told investigators that the sheriff had offered them $15,000 in cash to cover Derek's medical expenses and to sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing them from discussing Lucas's role in the assault. The Wilsons had reluctantly accepted, worried that challenging a law enforcement official would put their family at risk. But after Ethan's murder, they'd come to regret their decision, believing that if they'd pressed charges, Lucas might have received court-ordered treatment that could have prevented the fratricide. The existence of the NDA and the cash payment demonstrated that Sheriff Harrington had been consciously engaged in a cover-up, using money and intimidation to suppress evidence of his son's dangerousness. Prosecutors added witness tampering to Harrington's charges, and the Wilsons agreed to testify against him in exchange for immunity from any potential prosecution for accepting the payment. The December 2021 incident where Lucas had threatened to kill his mother provided the foundation for the child endangerment charges against Sheriff Harrington. The responding deputy's original reports, recovered from the department's computer system before Harrington could delete them, described a scene of extreme danger with Lucas being physically restrained while screaming death threats. One deputy had specifically recommended an emergency psychiatric hold, a legal mechanism for involuntarily committing someone who posed an imminent threat to themselves or others. Sheriff Harrington had overruled that recommendation and had pressured his deputies to downgrade the incident to a routine domestic disturbance. Jacqueline Harrington told investigators during her own interview that she'd begged her husband to have Lucas committed that night, that she'd been genuinely terrified Lucas would kill her, but Marcus had insisted that committing their son would destroy his career and the family's reputation. The sheriff had valued his public image over his wife's safety and his son's need for treatment, a decision that would prove fatal for Ethan less than 3 months later. The state's case against Sheriff Harrington for child endangerment rested on the argument that he had a duty as both a parent and a law enforcement officer to protect his children and community, and that he had systematically violated that duty. Legal experts brought in by prosecutor Nora Hughes explained that while parents generally have broad discretion in making medical decisions for their children, that discretion doesn't extend to withholding necessary treatment when a child poses a clear danger to others. Lucas's psychiatrist testified that he had sent Sheriff Harrington written warnings that discontinuing Lucas's medication without supervised tapering could result in catastrophic behavioral consequences, and that Lucas needed to be immediately hospitalized if his parents couldn't afford outpatient treatment. Harrington had ignored all of these warnings, never responding to the psychiatrist or seeking alternative care. That deliberate indifference to professional medical advice, combined with his suppression of evidence of Lucas's violence, met the legal standard for child endangerment under Colorado law. The abuse of office charges against Sheriff Harrington focused on his use of official resources and authority to further his personal agenda of protecting Lucas. Investigators discovered that Harrington had run background checks on Jennifer Martinez and the Wilson family using law enforcement databases, looking for anything he could use to discredit or intimidate them. He'd also used his position to ensure that Lucas's name never appeared in any official incident reports, manually editing database entries, and ordering subordinates to use generic descriptions like juvenile male rather than identifying Lucas by name. Most egregiously, Harrington had placed surveillance on Derek Wilson's family after they'd accepted his payoff, using department resources to monitor whether they were complying with the non-disclosure agreement. This misuse of government databases and equipment for personal purposes constituted a clear abuse of his official position and violated multiple department policies and state laws. The revelation of Sheriff Harrington's misconduct sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across Colorado and beyond. The Aspen County Sheriff's Department announced an independent review of all cases Harrington had handled during his tenure, concerned that his pattern of corruption might have extended to official investigations. The state attorney general opened a civil rights investigation into whether Harrington's actions had created a pattern of selective enforcement that violated citizens' constitutional rights. Law enforcement professional organizations condemned Harrington's behavior, with the Colorado Sheriff's Association issuing a statement emphasizing that his actions were antithetical to the values of integrity and public service that should define law enforcement. For the residents of Millbrook and Aspen, the betrayal was personal. They'd trusted Sheriff Harrington to protect their community, only to discover he'd been shielding a dangerous juvenile offender while allowing that offender's violence to escalate toward inevitable tragedy. The charging documents filed against Jacqueline Harrington on March 28, 2022, detailed her role in Lucas's descent into violence and her exploitation of his mental illness for profit. The child abuse and neglect charges stemmed from her decision to discontinue Lucas's medication despite having the financial means to continue treatment and despite receiving explicit warnings from his psychiatrist about the dangers. Prosecutor Nora Hughes argued that Jacqueline had prioritized her lifestyle and her blog business over her son's medical needs, a decision that directly contributed to his inability to control his violent impulses. The exploitation charges focused on Jacqueline's monetization of Lucas's struggles without his knowledge or consent, using his mental health crisis as content for her Mountain Mama Musings platform. Hughes obtained records showing that Jacqueline's blog posts specifically about Lucas's behavioral problems had generated over $40,000 in revenue through sponsorships, affiliate sales, and premium subscriptions, making his suffering literally profitable for her. The blog posts themselves became evidence in the criminal case against Jacqueline Harrington, with prosecutors presenting screenshots and archives to demonstrate the extent of her exploitation. In one particularly damning post from November 2021, Jacqueline had written about Lucas destroying furniture during a rage episode, included photos of the damage, and then pivoted to a sponsored advertisement for home insurance that could cover such damage. In another post from January 2022, she described Lucas's increasing threats of violence and then seamlessly transitioned to promoting a meditation app that she claimed helped her cope with the stress. The posts never mentioned that Lucas was off his prescribed medication, never acknowledged that he needed emergency psychiatric intervention, and never expressed genuine concern for his well-being. They were simply content designed to generate engagement and revenue. The callousness of using her son's deteriorating mental health as a business strategy shocked even experienced prosecutors who thought they'd seen every form of parental exploitation. The three interconnected criminal cases, Lucas for murder, Marcus for obstruction and child endangerment, Jacqueline for abuse and exploitation, created a legal labyrinth that would dominate Colorado's court system for the next year. Defense attorneys for all three defendants immediately began filing motions to sever the cases, arguing that the intense media coverage and interconnected nature of the charges would make it impossible for any of them to receive a fair trial. But prosecutor Nora Hughes successfully argued that the cases should proceed separately, but with judicial coordination, as the evidence in each case was relevant to understanding the context of the others. The judge assigned to oversee all three cases, the Honorable Robert Chen, agreed to a coordinated approach, setting trial dates that would allow the prosecution to build from Lucas's trial to his parents' trials, using the findings in each case to inform the next. The legal strategy was ambitious and potentially risky, but Hughes believed it was necessary to achieve justice for Ethan Thompson and accountability for all who had failed him. The pretrial proceedings for Lucas Lopez's murder case began in earnest in April 2022, with defense attorney Sarah Mitchell filing a flurry of motions challenging everything from the admissibility of Lucas's confession to the constitutionality of charging a 13-year-old as an adult. Mitchell, a veteran public defender specializing in juvenile cases, argued that Lucas had been subjected to coercive interrogation tactics despite his age and had not fully understood his rights when he waived them. She presented expert testimony from child psychologists explaining that adolescent brains are not fully developed, particularly in areas governing impulse control and understanding long-term consequences, and that Lucas couldn't have formed the specific intent required for first-degree murder. Prosecutor Nora Hughes countered with the evidence of premeditation, the deleted internet searches, the theft of his father's tactical flashlight, the attempted staging of the crime scene, arguing that Lucas had demonstrated a level of planning and cover-up consciousness that belied any claim of diminished capacity due to age. The venue for Lucas's trial became a contentious issue, with both sides arguing about whether an impartial jury could be seated in Aspen given the intense media coverage of the case. Defense attorney Mitchell filed a motion for change of venue, presenting survey evidence showing that over 80% of potential jurors in the Aspen area had already formed opinions about Lucas's guilt based on news reports about his father's arrest and corruption. But prosecutor Hughes successfully argued that the case should remain in Aspen, where Ethan had lived and died, and that with proper voir dire, an impartial jury could be seated. Judge Robert Chen sided with the prosecution, ruling that the trial would be held in Aspen, but that jury selection would be extensive and would include questions designed to identify bias. The judge also imposed a gag order on all parties, prohibiting them from making public statements about the case until after the verdict, an attempt to limit the pretrial publicity that had already saturated local and national media. Jury selection for Lucas Lopez's trial began on January 9, 2023, in a courtroom in Aspen, Colorado, that had been modified to accommodate the intense public interest in the case. Judge Chen had ordered that 200 prospective jurors be summoned, anticipating that a large percentage would be dismissed for cause due to pretrial knowledge or fixed opinions. The voir dire process was painstaking, with each potential juror being questioned individually about their knowledge of the case, their views on juvenile justice, their feelings about mental illness as a mitigating factor in criminal behavior, and their ability to consider a sentence of life without parole for a child. Many potential jurors broke down in tears when asked if they could vote to essentially end a 13-year-old's life by consigning him to permanent incarceration, and those who expressed certainty that they could not were dismissed. After 5 days of jury selection, 12 jurors and 4 alternates were seated, a group that included teachers, nurses, retirees, and small business owners, all of whom had sworn they could set aside their preconceptions and decide the case based solely on the evidence presented. The courtroom itself became a focal point of divided public opinion about the case. The gallery seating was carefully managed by court security, with half the seats reserved for Ethan Thompson's extended family and supporters, identified by the blue ribbons they wore in his memory. The other half was reserved for supporters of Lucas Lopez, many wearing green ribbons to match the color of the hoodie that had become a symbol of the case, who argued that a 13-year-old couldn't be held fully accountable for his actions. The visual of the divided gallery with blue and green ribbons creating a stark color divide down the center aisle was captured by courtroom sketch artists and became an iconic image representing the moral complexity of prosecuting child offenders. Victim impact advocates sat on the blue ribbon side, while juvenile justice reform activists sat on the green ribbon side, both groups united in their grief for Ethan, but bitterly divided on whether Lucas deserved mercy or condemnation. Prosecutor Nora Hughes's opening statement on January 16, 2023, was a masterclass in storytelling that humanized Ethan Thompson while building an irrefutable case against his killer. Hughes began by projecting a photo of Ethan on the courtroom's video screens, an 8-year-old boy with a gap-toothed smile, wearing a Colorado Rockies baseball cap, his whole life ahead of him. She described Ethan's love of dinosaurs, his dream of becoming a paleontologist, his kindness to other children at his school. Then Hughes methodically walked the jury through the events of March 15, 2022, using timeline graphics, crime scene photos, and evidence exhibits to show how Lucas had researched murder, stolen his father's weapon, attacked Ethan from behind, and attempted to cover up the crime. She emphasized the physical evidence, the fibers clutched in Ethan's hand as he fought for his life, the blood spatter that told the story of a brutal beating, the deleted searches that proved premeditation. Hughes ended her opening by asking the jury to remember that while Lucas was a child, so was Ethan, and Ethan had been denied the chance to grow up because his older brother had chosen violence over mercy. Defense attorney Sarah Mitchell's opening statement took a dramatically different approach, portraying Lucas as another victim of failed systems and parental neglect. Mitchell didn't deny that Lucas had killed Ethan. The evidence made denial impossible. But she argued that the jury needed to understand the context of how a 13-year-old could commit such an act. She described Lucas's intermittent explosive disorder, a documented mental illness that caused uncontrollable rage episodes, and explained how his parents had discontinued his medication despite psychiatric warnings. Mitchell painted Sheriff Marcus Harrington as an abusive father who had modeled violence as problem-solving, who had beaten Lucas and normalized brutality in their home. She described Jacqueline Harrington's exploitation of Lucas's mental illness for blog profit, while refusing to pay for his treatment. Mitchell argued that Lucas had been set up to fail by the very people who should have protected him, and that while Ethan's death was tragic, the law required consideration of Lucas's diminished capacity due to age and mental illness. She ended by urging the jury to remember that Lucas was still a child, that his brain wasn't fully developed, and that condemning him to die in prison would be giving up on the possibility of rehabilitation and redemption. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks, with Nora Hughes calling 47 witnesses who built a comprehensive narrative of Lucas's crime and consciousness of guilt. Crime scene investigator Patricia Mendez walked the jury through the blood spatter evidence using laser pointers and physical demonstrations to show how Ethan had been on his knees when the fatal blow was struck. Textile expert Dr. Samantha Wells testified about the fiber match, explaining in accessible language how the green fibers in Ethan's hand could only have come from Lucas's hoodie. Digital forensics specialist Angela Ramirez presented the deleted internet searches, complete with screenshots showing Lucas's research into making murder look like an accident. The testimony was technical but devastating, each expert witness adding another layer to the prosecution's case that Lucas had planned, executed, and attempted to cover up his brother's murder with a level of sophistication that belied defense claims of diminished capacity. The most emotional testimony came from Ethan Thompson's maternal grandmother, Margaret Thompson, who had been caring for Ethan's belongings since his death. Margaret described Ethan as gentle soul, who loved nature, who would rescue insects from drowning in puddles, who cried when he saw animals suffering. She testified that Ethan had confided in her about being afraid of Lucas, about Lucas's violent temper and threats, but that she'd assumed it was normal sibling conflict and had never imagined Lucas would actually hurt him. Margaret broke down on the stand when Prosecutor Hughes showed her the tactical flashlight that had been the murder weapon, and she had to be escorted from the courtroom when she became too distraught to continue. The image of Ethan's grandmother weeping while Lucas sat expressionless at the defense table was captured by courtroom artists and became another powerful symbol of the case's human cost. The prosecution's presentation of Lucas's confession was the trial's dramatic centerpiece. Detective Reginald Torres took the stand and walked the jury through the 6-hour interrogation, explaining how he'd built rapport with Lucas, presented evidence piece by piece, and ultimately obtained a detailed admission. The video of the confession was played for the jury in its entirety, showing Lucas's flat affect as he described bludgeoning Ethan to death, his matter-of-fact tone as he explained that he was disciplining his brother, his lack of remorse when asked if he felt bad about what he'd done. Defense attorney Mitchell objected repeatedly, arguing that showing the confession was prejudicial and that Lucas's demeanor was the result of shock rather than callousness. But Judge Chen overruled each objection, finding that the confession's probative value outweighed any prejudice. As the jury watched 13-year-old Lucas calmly describing how he'd killed his 8-year-old brother, several jurors were seen wiping away tears while others took copious notes, their faces grave with the weight of the decision they would eventually have to make. The prosecution's case also included testimony from Lucas's former psychiatrist, Dr. James Wong, who explained the nature of intermittent explosive disorder and the importance of medication compliance. Dr. Wong testified that Lucas's condition was treatable with proper medication and therapy, and that the decision to discontinue his prescriptions had been medically irresponsible and dangerous. But under cross-examination by defense attorney Mitchell, Dr. Wong was forced to acknowledge that even with medication, Lucas still posed a risk for violent episodes and that the condition could cause behavior that the person couldn't fully control. Mitchell used this testimony to support her argument that Lucas's mental illness had substantially impaired his ability to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct and to conform his behavior to the law. The psychiatric testimony walked a fine line, with both sides trying to use the same expert to support contradictory narratives about Lucas's culpability. The prosecution's forensic case reached its climax with the testimony of Dr. Raymond Chen, the medical examiner who had performed Ethan Thompson's autopsy. Dr. Chen's testimony was clinical and precise, walking the jury through the injuries that had ended Ethan's young life while carefully explaining the medical evidence in terms a lay jury could understand. He described how Ethan had suffered 5 distinct impacts to his head and body, with the fatal blow striking the back of his skull and causing a catastrophic brain bleed, Dr. Chen used anatomical diagrams and autopsy photos to show the progression of injuries, explaining how the pattern indicated Ethan had been struck multiple times while trying to protect himself. The defensive wounds on Ethan's arms and hands, Dr. Chen testified, showed that the child had been conscious and fighting for survival during the attack, raising his arms to try to block the blows that were raining down on him from his older brother. The most devastating part of Dr. Chen's testimony involved his analysis of Ethan's final moments. Based on the medical evidence, Dr. Chen explained that Ethan had likely survived for several minutes after the fatal blow, his brain gradually shutting down as blood pooled inside his skull. The pattern of blood spatter and the position of Ethan's body suggested that Lucas had stood over his dying brother for some period of time, watching as Ethan's life ebbed away. Dr. Chen couldn't say definitively whether Ethan had been conscious during those final minutes, but he testified that it was medically possible the child had been aware of what was happening, paralyzed and dying while his killer watched. This testimony caused audible gasps and sobs from the gallery, particularly from Ethan's family members wearing blue ribbons. Judge Chen had to call a brief recess to allow people to compose themselves, and when the trial resumed, several jurors had red eyes, clearly affected by the medical examiner's sobering testimony. Under cross-examination, defense attorney Sarah Mitchell tried to use Dr. Chen's testimony to support the argument that Lucas had acted in a dissociative state during the attack. Mitchell asked whether the nature of the injuries was consistent with someone in the grip of an uncontrollable rage episode, striking repeatedly without conscious thought. Dr. Chen acknowledged that the multiple impacts could suggest a loss of control, but he also noted that the positioning of the blows, all striking vulnerable areas like the head and neck, suggested some degree of targeting rather than random violence. Mitchell also pressed Dr. Chen on whether the attempted staging of the crime scene might have been done while Lucas was still in a dissociative state, not fully aware of what he'd done. Dr. Chen responded that he was a medical examiner, not a psychologist, and couldn't speak to Lucas's mental state, only to the physical evidence of how Ethan had died. The exchange highlighted the fundamental tension in the case. Did the evidence show a calculated murder or a tragic loss of control by a mentally ill child? The prosecution's presentation of the digital evidence through Angela Ramirez's testimony proved crucial in establishing premeditation. Ramirez used PowerPoint presentations to show the jury exactly what Lucas had searched for on his phone on March 12, 2022, and how the searches progressed from general queries about making deaths look accidental to specific questions about forensic evidence and juvenile criminal liability. The timeline of the searches showed deliberate research conducted over a 45-minute period, with Lucas reading articles, watching videos, and taking notes about how to commit and cover up a murder. Ramirez testified that the specific searches about whether kids could go to jail for killing siblings demonstrated that Lucas had been contemplating fratricide specifically, not just violence in general. The prosecutor used this testimony to argue that Lucas had planned Ethan's murder for at least 3 days, giving him ample time to reconsider and choose differently, which made this first-degree murder under Colorado law. The defense's cross-examination of Ramirez focused on contextualizing the searches as adolescent curiosity rather than genuine planning. Mitchell pointed out that teenagers often search for disturbing content online, that true crime content is hugely popular with young people, and that browsing such material doesn't mean someone is actually planning to commit murder. She highlighted that Lucas had also searched for video game walkthroughs and sports scores during the same time period, suggesting his internet activity was scattered and impulsive, rather than methodically focused on planning a crime. Ramirez had to acknowledge that based solely on the searches, she couldn't definitively prove Lucas's intent, only document what he'd looked for online. But on redirect examination, Prosecutor Hughes asked Ramirez to pull up the exact timestamps of the searches, showing that Lucas had conducted the murder-related research in a concentrated burst with no other searches interspersed, suggesting focused attention rather than casual browsing. The digital evidence remained powerful proof of premeditation, despite the defense's attempts to minimize its significance. The testimony of Jennifer Martinez about Lucas's torture of her dog in August 2021 provided crucial context for understanding Lucas's escalating violence. Martinez described finding Lucas in the woods behind their properties, holding her golden retriever Buddy down while burning the dog's paws with cigarette lighters, laughing at the animal's pain. She testified that when she'd confronted Lucas, he'd shown no remorse, instead telling her that Buddy deserved it for barking too much and disturbing his sleep. Martinez broke down on the stand when describing how Buddy had limped for weeks after the incident, how the dog now cowered whenever Lucas approached, how she'd trusted Sheriff Harrington to handle the situation appropriately, only to have him cover it up. Prosecutor Hughes used Martinez's testimony to establish a pattern of escalating violence, from animal torture to assault to murder, and to show that Lucas's capacity for cruelty and violence had been evident long before Ethan's death. Derek Wilson's testimony about being assaulted by Lucas at school was equally powerful in demonstrating the pattern of violence. Derek, now 14, testified that Lucas had attacked him without warning in the school cafeteria after Derek had made a joke about Lucas's clothes. Derek described how Lucas had grabbed his head and slammed it into the table repeatedly, how he'd felt his face breaking, how he'd thought Lucas was going to kill him before other students pulled Lucas off. Derek showed the jury the scar across his forehead from the attack, a permanent reminder of Lucas's capacity for explosive violence. Under cross-examination, Mitchell tried to portray the incident as a mutual fight that had gotten out of hand. But Derek firmly testified that he'd never struck Lucas, had only tried to protect himself, and that Lucas's attack had been completely one-sided. The testimony from both Martinez and Wilson painted a picture of Lucas as a child who had demonstrated escalating violence toward both animals and humans in the months leading up to his brother's murder. The prosecution's final witness was forensic psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Tran, whose evaluation of Lucas had concluded he posed a high risk for future violence and showed minimal remorse for his actions. Dr. Tran testified about her extensive interviews with Lucas, during which he'd discussed killing Ethan in the same flat, emotionless tone he might use to describe doing homework. She explained that Lucas's lack of empathy, his inability to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct, and his tendency to blame others for his violent reactions were all consistent with emerging antisocial personality disorder. Dr. Tran testified that while Lucas's intermittent explosive disorder was a genuine mental illness that affected his impulse control, it didn't render him unable to understand that killing was wrong or to choose differently. Most damningly, Dr. Tran testified that, in her professional opinion, Lucas represented an ongoing danger to society and would require decades of intensive treatment in a secure facility before he could potentially be safely released. The cross-examination of Dr. Tran became a battle of competing psychological narratives. Defense attorney Mitchell presented Lucas's history of parental neglect, medication withdrawal, and exposure to domestic violence, arguing that these factors had created the conditions for his crime and demonstrated that he was a victim as well as a perpetrator. Dr. Tran acknowledged that Lucas's environment had been dysfunctional and that his parents bore significant responsibility for failing to get him proper treatment. But she maintained that environmental factors didn't excuse Lucas's behavior or reduce his culpability under the law. Mitchell pressed Dr. Tran on whether a 13-year-old's brain was sufficiently developed to form the specific intent required for first-degree murder, citing neuroscience research about adolescent decision-making. Dr. Tran responded that while adolescent brains are still developing, 13-year-olds are capable of understanding basic moral concepts like killing is wrong and making deliberate choices. The psychological testimony left both sides claiming victory, with the prosecution arguing Lucas was dangerous and culpable, while the defense argued he was damaged and deserving of mercy. The prosecution rested its case on February 3, 2023, after presenting 3 weeks of evidence documenting Lucas's crime in exhaustive detail. Prosecutor Nora Hughes's case had been methodical and overwhelming, with physical evidence, digital evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis all pointing to the same conclusion. Lucas Lopez had planned and executed his brother's murder, then attempted to cover it up. The fiber evidence, the footprint, the blood spatter, the deleted searches, the confession, each piece of evidence had been presented with clarity and precision, building a narrative of premeditated fratricide that was difficult for the defense to counter. As Hughes formally announced, "The state rests," she made eye contact with each juror, her expression conveying the gravity of the decision they would soon face. In the gallery, Ethan's family members clutched their blue ribbons, while Lucas's supporters fingered their green ribbons, both groups knowing that the defense phase of the trial would determine whether Lucas spent his life in prison or had any hope of eventual freedom. Defense attorney Sarah Mitchell's case began on February 6, 2023, with a strategic focus on humanizing Lucas Lopez and contextualizing his crime within the framework of parental failure and untreated mental illness. Mitchell's first witness was Dr. Robert Jameson, a child psychiatrist who had evaluated Lucas and diagnosed him with severe intermittent explosive disorder, a condition characterized by sudden episodes of uncontrollable rage disproportionate to any triggering event. Dr. Jameson explained to the jury that during these explosive episodes, individuals experience a loss of cognitive control, with their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational decision-making, essentially going offline, while their amygdala, the emotional center, takes over. He testified that Lucas's attacks on the dog, on Derek Wilson, and ultimately on Ethan all bore the hallmarks of explosive episodes, with sudden onset, excessive violence, and limited memory of the events afterward. Dr. Jameson's testimony was designed to create sympathy for Lucas as someone whose brain literally betrayed him during moments of stress, rather than as a cold-blooded killer who chose to murder his brother. The defense presented extensive evidence about Lucas's medication history and the decision to discontinue his prescriptions. Dr. Jameson testified that the antipsychotic and mood-stabilizing medications Lucas had been taking were essential for managing his explosive episodes, acting as a chemical brake on his rage responses. He explained that abruptly stopping these medications, rather than tapering under medical supervision, could lead to a rebound effect where symptoms return more severely than before. Dr. Jameson reviewed Lucas's psychiatric records, showing that while on medication, he'd had 0 violent incidents at school and only minor conflicts at home. But after his parents stopped filling his prescriptions in September 2021, his violence had escalated dramatically, culminating in Ethan's murder 6 months later. The psychiatrist testified that, in his professional opinion, if Lucas had remained on his medications, Ethan would still be alive today, making his parents' decision to discontinue treatment a direct contributing factor to the tragedy. Under cross-examination, prosecutor Nora Hughes challenged Dr. Jameson's assertion that medication would have prevented the murder. Hughes presented research studies showing that intermittent explosive disorder, even when treated, still carried a risk of violent episodes, and that medications reduced but didn't eliminate that risk. She pressed Dr. Jameson on whether Lucas could have chosen not to follow through on his violent impulses, whether he understood that killing was wrong, whether he had the capacity to seek help rather than attacking his brother. Dr. Jameson acknowledged that IED didn't render someone completely unable to control their behavior, that there was often a moment of choice before the explosion occurred. But he maintained that expecting a 13-year-old with untreated IED to make rational choices in a moment of rage was unrealistic, especially when that child had no healthy coping mechanisms and had witnessed violence modeled as problem-solving by his father. The defense's most powerful testimony came from Lucas himself, who took the stand on February 10, 2023, against his attorney's initial advice. Lucas, now 14, appeared small and vulnerable in the witness box, dressed in a button-down shirt that seemed too large for his thin frame. Defense attorney Mitchell walked Lucas through his troubled childhood, his diagnosis with IED at age 10, the years of struggling with uncontrollable rage, the relief he'd felt when medication finally brought his symptoms under control. Lucas testified about how his father had routinely used physical violence to discipline him, hitting him with belts, slamming him against walls, screaming in his face that he needed to man up and stop being weak. He described watching his father handle conflicts, both at work and at home, through intimidation and force, learning that violence was how strong men solved problems. Lucas's testimony painted a picture of a child raised in an environment where brutality was normalized and where getting help for mental health issues was seen as shameful weakness. When Mitchell asked Lucas to describe the day of Ethan's death, the courtroom fell silent. Lucas testified that he'd been playing an online game when Ethan had come into his room begging to play too. Lucas had said no, telling Ethan he was in the middle of an important match, but Ethan had persisted, grabbing at the controller. In the struggle, Ethan had knocked the gaming console off the desk, and Lucas had heard the hard drive inside shatter when it hit the floor. Lucas described feeling like something broke inside me too. A red fog descending over his vision, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. He testified that he'd grabbed the tactical flashlight from his father's duty belt, which he'd taken earlier that day because he felt safer having it, and followed Ethan into the hallway. Lucas began crying on the stand as he described hitting Ethan, saying he remembered the first blow, but that everything after that was like watching myself from outside my body. He testified that he hadn't meant to kill Ethan, that he loved his brother, that he wished he could take it all back. The prosecution's cross-examination of Lucas was methodical and devastating. Nora Hughes walked Lucas through his deleted internet searches, asking him to explain why, if the killing was an uncontrollable impulse, he had spent 45 minutes 3 days earlier researching how to make murder look like an accident. Lucas struggled to answer, eventually claiming he'd been curious about true crime, but hadn't actually been planning to hurt anyone. Hughes asked Lucas about the tactical flashlight. Why had he taken it from his father's duty belt if not to use as a weapon? Lucas claimed he'd taken it because he felt anxious, and the flashlight made him feel protected, a response Hughes immediately challenged by pointing out that feeling the need for protection in your own home from your 8-year-old brother didn't make sense unless you were planning violence. Hughes then showed Lucas crime scene photos of Ethan's body, asking him to explain how someone in a dissociative state could have positioned the body to look like a fall down the stairs. Lucas broke down completely, unable to answer, his sobs the only sound in the courtroom. The defense presented testimony from Marcus Harrington, who appeared in court wearing an orange jail jumpsuit, shackled and escorted by deputies. Harrington testified about his parenting failures, admitting that he'd used physical discipline that crossed the line into abuse, that he'd modeled violence as conflict resolution, that he'd prioritized his career and reputation over his son's mental health needs. He described the financial pressures that had led to discontinuing Lucas's medication, explaining that with a mortgage, car payments, and his daughter's college tuition, finding an extra $800 per month had seemed impossible. Harrington testified that he'd never imagined Lucas would actually hurt Ethan, that he'd thought the earlier violent incidents were isolated episodes that Lucas would outgrow. The former sheriff broke down on the stand, telling the jury that he took full responsibility for creating the environment that made Ethan's death possible, and begging them to show Lucas the mercy he hadn't shown his own sons. Prosecutor Hughes's cross-examination of Marcus Harrington was brutal and unforgiving. She confronted him with evidence of his cover-ups, his intimidation of witnesses, his abuse of his official position to protect Lucas from consequences. Hughes asked Harrington why, if money was so tight, his wife had been earning thousands of dollars per month from her blog, money that could have paid for Lucas's medication, but instead had gone to maintaining their affluent lifestyle. She pressed him on why he'd chosen to pay Derek Wilson's family $15,000 in hush money, but claimed he couldn't afford $800 per month for his son's essential psychiatric medication. Harrington had no good answers, his testimony collapsing into admission that he'd made terrible choices, that he'd valued his reputation over his children's safety, that he deserved to be held accountable. Hughes ended her cross-examination by asking Harrington if he believed Lucas should be held accountable too, given that Lucas had made the choice to kill Ethan. Harrington's answer, "He's just a child," hung in the air as Hughes sat down, her point made that even Lucas's own father couldn't reconcile his son's youth with his capacity for calculated violence. The defense's final witness was Jacqueline Harrington, who testified about her failures as a mother while simultaneously trying to generate sympathy for Lucas. Jacqueline described struggling with postpartum depression after Ethan's birth, becoming emotionally distant from both her sons, finding an outlet in blogging that gradually consumed more and more of her attention and energy. She admitted that she'd known Lucas was deteriorating without his medication, but had rationalized that they'd find cheaper alternatives eventually, that he seemed to be managing okay without it. Jacqueline testified that she'd used her blog as a coping mechanism, a way to process the stress of parenting a troubled child without fully appreciating that she was exploiting Lucas's suffering for profit. She claimed that she'd never intended to hurt Lucas through her writing, that she'd thought she was helping other parents by sharing her experiences, but that, looking back, she could see how wrong she'd been. Prosecutor Hughes's cross-examination of Jacqueline focused relentlessly on the blog's monetization and the conscious choices she'd made to prioritize profit over her son's welfare. Hughes presented evidence showing Jacqueline had earned over $40,000 from blog content specifically about Lucas's behavioral problems, money that could have paid for years of his medication and therapy. She confronted Jacqueline with specific blog posts where she'd described Lucas's violent episodes in graphic detail, complete with photos, while never mentioning he was off his medication or needed help. Hughes asked Jacqueline why she'd thought it was appropriate to share her son's mental health struggles with thousands of strangers online while refusing to spend money on his psychiatric care. Jacqueline's answers became increasingly defensive and incoherent, ultimately admitting that she'd made terrible mistakes, but insisting she'd always loved Lucas and never meant to contribute to the tragedy. Hughes ended by asking Jacqueline if she planned to write about Ethan's murder for her blog, a question that caused gasps in the courtroom and left Jacqueline speechless. The defense's presentation of evidence about Jacqueline Harrington's blog exploitation became one of the trial's most shocking revelations, even though it had been reported in pretrial coverage. Defense attorney Sarah Mitchell made the strategic decision to introduce this evidence herself, rather than letting the prosecution use it on rebuttal, hoping to control the narrative and frame it as additional proof that Lucas had been failed by his parents. Mitchell presented archived copies of Jacqueline's Mountain Mama Musings blog, walking the jury through a timeline of posts that documented Lucas's deteriorating mental health while simultaneously monetizing his suffering. The earliest posts from 2019 and 2020 had been relatively innocuous, focusing on parenting tips and family activities. But starting in 2021, after Lucas's IED diagnosis, the blog's focus had shifted dramatically toward content about managing a troubled teen that attracted sponsorships from therapy apps, insurance companies, and pharmaceutical alternatives. The specific blog posts introduced as evidence painted a disturbing picture of a mother who had viewed her son's mental illness as content to be mined for engagement and revenue. In a post from July 2021 titled, "When Your Child Scares You Living with Teen Rage," Jacqueline had described in graphic detail one of Lucas's explosive episodes, including photos of a shattered mirror and punched walls. The post had been sponsored by a home insurance company, with Jacqueline seamlessly transitioning from describing her fear of Lucas to promoting insurance coverage for damage caused by family members. Another post from September 2021, published just days after Lucas's medication had been discontinued, was titled, "Choosing Natural Alternatives, Our Journey Away from Big Pharma," and promoted various supplements and meditation apps as alternatives to psychiatric medication. The post never mentioned that Lucas's psychiatrist had strongly opposed discontinuing his prescriptions, framing the decision instead as an empowered choice by an informed parent seeking holistic solutions. The most damaging evidence came from Jacqueline's premium subscription content, which required readers to pay $25 per month for access to her detailed journals about parenting Lucas. These journal entries, introduced into evidence by the defense, showed that Jacqueline had been fully aware Lucas was spiraling out of control without his medication, but had continued to document his deterioration for profit, rather than seeking emergency intervention. A journal entry from November 2021 described Lucas's threat to kill her, expressing genuine fear that he might follow through, but ended with Jacqueline musing about whether she should write a book about her experiences. An entry from February 2022, less than 2 weeks before Ethan's death, described Lucas's increasing fixation on Ethan and his resentment over the attention Ethan received due to his medical needs. Jacqueline had written that she was worried something bad might happen, but that she felt paralyzed about what to do, a statement that defense attorney Mitchell argued demonstrated Jacqueline's awareness that tragedy was imminent, yet her failure to prevent it. The revelation of the blog's financial success created a crucial piece of context for the jury. Defense attorney Mitchell presented accounting records showing that Mountain Mama Musings had generated $72,000 in revenue in 2021, with the majority coming from content specifically about Lucas's behavioral problems. Mitchell argued that this income demonstrated the Harringtons could easily have afforded Lucas's $800 monthly medication cost, making their decision to discontinue his treatment not a financial necessity, but a choice driven by other priorities. She presented evidence that the family had taken an expensive ski vacation in December 2021, had purchased a new SUV in January 2022, and had made significant charitable donations to maintain their community standing, all while claiming they couldn't afford their son's essential psychiatric medication. The financial evidence painted the Harringtons as parents who had valued their lifestyle and image over their son's mental health, creating the conditions for Ethan's murder. The most shocking moment of the entire trial came during defense attorney Mitchell's closing arguments when she revealed additional blog evidence that hadn't been introduced during the testimony phase. Mitchell informed Judge Chen that she had just received evidence that morning showing Jacqueline Harrington had drafted but not published a blog post about Ethan's death and Lucas's arrest, complete with affiliate links to books about juvenile crime and grief counseling services. The draft post, which Mitchell presented to the court, was titled, "The Unthinkable, When Your Child Takes a Life," and positioned Jacqueline as a tragic mother processing unimaginable grief while offering hope and guidance to others facing similar tragedies. The draft included sponsored content from a funeral services company and a criminal defense attorney referral service. Prosecutor Hughes immediately objected, arguing the evidence was improperly introduced and prejudicial, but Judge Chen allowed it after Jacqueline's attorney confirmed its authenticity while claiming the draft had been created as a processing exercise never intended for publication. The courtroom reaction to the revelation about the unpublished blog post was one of universal horror. Jurors' faces showed disgust and disbelief that a mother would draft monetized content about her son's murder of her other son. Ethan's family members in the blue ribbon section began shouting at Jacqueline Harrington, who was present in the courtroom, calling her a monster and accusing her of caring more about blog revenue than her dead son. Judge Chen had to call a recess to restore order, and when the trial resumed, he warned the gallery that any further outbursts would result in removal from the courtroom. The unpublished blog post became a focal point of media coverage, with legal analysts debating whether its introduction had been ethical and whether it would unfairly prejudice the jury against Lucas by association with his mother's grotesque behavior. Defense attorney Mitchell used the blog revelation strategically in her closing argument, framing it as the ultimate proof that Lucas had never had a chance. She argued that a child raised by a mother who monetized his suffering and a father who modeled violence couldn't be held to the same standard of culpability as a child raised in a loving, stable home. Mitchell painted Lucas as a victim of systemic failures, failed parenting, failed mental health treatment, failed intervention by authorities who had witnessed his escalating violence but done nothing. She reminded the jury that Lucas had been diagnosed with a serious mental illness, had been taken off essential medication, had witnessed domestic violence, and had internalized his father's message that violence solves problems. Mitchell argued that while Ethan's death was a tragedy, condemning Lucas to life without parole would be giving up on a child who had never been given the tools to succeed and who might still be capable of rehabilitation with proper treatment. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by Nora Hughes over 4 hours on February 17, 2023, was a methodical dismantling of the defense's sympathy narrative. Hughes acknowledged that Lucas had been failed by his parents and by the system, but argued that those failures didn't excuse or mitigate his crime. She walked the jury through the evidence of premeditation, the deleted searches 3 days before the murder, the theft of the tactical flashlight, the attempted staging of the crime scene, arguing that this level of planning demonstrated Lucas had the capacity to understand what he was doing and to choose differently. Hughes pointed out that Lucas had managed to control his violent impulses in other contexts. He'd never attacked a teacher, a police officer, or anyone bigger and stronger than him, suggesting his explosive rage was selective rather than truly uncontrollable. She argued that Lucas had targeted Ethan because Ethan was small, defenseless, and vulnerable, the same reason predators choose their victims. The prosecutor's closing focused extensively on Ethan Thompson, reminding the jury that this case was fundamentally about a child who had been murdered in his own home by someone who was supposed to protect him. Hughes displayed photos of Ethan throughout her closing. Ethan playing with dinosaurs, Ethan at his 8th birthday party, Ethan's school photo showing his gap-toothed smile. She described Ethan's dreams and potential, all destroyed because Lucas couldn't control his rage over a broken gaming console. Hughes addressed the sympathy many felt for Lucas as a troubled child, arguing that Ethan had been a child too, but one who would never have the chance to grow up, to get help, to turn his life around. She told the jury that justice for Ethan required accountability for Lucas, and that while life without parole was harsh, it was the only sentence that recognized the permanence of what Lucas had taken from his brother. The rebuttal phase of closing arguments gave defense attorney Mitchell one final chance to plead for mercy. She acknowledged that Ethan's death was a tragedy and that Lucas needed to be held accountable, but argued that accountability could take forms other than life imprisonment. Mitchell urged the jury to consider Lucas's age, his mental illness, his abusive upbringing, and his potential for rehabilitation. She cited brain science research showing that adolescent brains are still developing and that juveniles have greater capacity for change than adults. Mitchell argued that sentencing Lucas to life without parole at age 13 was essentially giving up on him as a human being, declaring that he was irredeemable before his brain had even finished developing. She ended her closing by asking the jury to imagine Lucas at age 30, after years of treatment and therapy, potentially a different person who could contribute positively to society, and to leave open that possibility through their verdict. The jury received the case on February 17, 2023, after Judge Chen provided detailed instructions on the law of first-degree murder, the elements the prosecution had to prove, and the lesser included offenses they could consider. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days before returning with their verdict on February 19th. The courtroom was packed, with every seat filled and spectators spilling into the hallway outside. The blue and green ribbons that had divided the gallery throughout the trial were still evident, marking the supporters of Ethan versus the supporters of Lucas. When the jury foreman announced guilty of first-degree murder, the courtroom erupted with both cheers and sobs. Ethan's family members embraced each other, crying tears of relief that their grandson's killer had been held accountable. On the other side of the courtroom, Lucas's supporters, including relatives who believed he was as much a victim as Ethan, wept for a different reason: grief over a child whose life was effectively over at age 14. Lucas showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read, maintaining the flat affect that had characterized his demeanor throughout most of the trial. His court-appointed attorney, Sarah Mitchell, placed a hand on his shoulder, and only then did Lucas begin to cry quietly. The verdict had been expected by most legal observers, given the strength of the prosecution's evidence, but it still carried tremendous weight as the first step toward a sentence that would determine whether Lucas would ever walk free again. Judge Chen thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for February 28, 2023, giving both sides time to prepare victim impact statements and sentencing arguments. As Lucas was led out of the courtroom in shackles, photographers captured his image. A slight, young-looking 14-year-old in an oversized dress shirt, his life trajectory permanently altered by a violent choice made in a moment of uncontrolled rage. The sentencing hearing for Lucas Lopez began on February 28, 2023, in the same Aspen courtroom where his trial had taken place. The proceeding was bifurcated into two distinct phases. First, victim impact statements from Ethan Thompson's family and community, and second, arguments from both the prosecution and defense about the appropriate sentence. Colorado law allowed for a sentence of life without possibility of parole for first-degree murder committed by juveniles, but it wasn't mandatory, giving Judge Robert Chen discretion to impose a lesser sentence if he found mitigating factors. The courtroom was once again divided, with blue ribbons on one side representing Ethan's family and supporters who wanted the maximum sentence, and green ribbons on the other representing juvenile justice advocates who argued that sentencing a 13-year-old to die in prison violated basic human rights. The victim impact statements began with Ethan Thompson's maternal grandmother, Margaret Thompson, who had essentially raised Ethan while his mother worked. Margaret described Ethan as a gentle, curious child who had never hurt anyone, who collected dinosaur books and dreamed of becoming a paleontologist. She testified that Ethan had been terrified of Lucas in the weeks before his death, had told her that Lucas threatened him and hurt him when their parents weren't looking, but that she'd dismissed it as normal sibling rivalry. Margaret's voice broke as she described the guilt of not taking Ethan's fears seriously, of not protecting him from the danger living under his own roof. She told Judge Chen that she woke up every morning thinking about Ethan's last moments, about his terror as his brother beat him to death, about whether he had called out for help that never came. Margaret ended her statement by looking directly at Lucas and saying she forgave him, but that forgiveness didn't mean he shouldn't face consequences for destroying her grandson's future. Ethan's father, David Thompson, who had been divorced from Jacqueline Harrington since 2018, delivered a victim impact statement filled with rage at both Lucas and the Harrington parents. Thompson testified that he had fought for custody of Ethan multiple times, concerned about the environment in the Harrington household, but had been unable to convince courts that Ethan was in danger. He described the Harringtons as image-obsessed people who cared more about appearing perfect than actually being good parents. Thompson told the court that he'd specifically warned Jacqueline about Lucas's violence toward Ethan, that he'd offered to take Ethan full-time to keep him safe, but that Jacqueline had refused because losing custody would damage her Mountain Mama brand. Thompson's testimony added another layer of culpability to the parents' failures, suggesting that Ethan's death could have been prevented if his mother had been willing to prioritize his safety over her blog persona. Multiple classmates and teachers from Ethan's elementary school provided victim impact statements describing the child's kindness and the hole his death had left in their community. Ethan's second-grade teacher testified that he had been the student who welcomed new kids, who comforted classmates who were crying, who volunteered to help clean up without being asked. Several of Ethan's friends, now 9 years old, stood with their parents and haltingly described missing their friend, not understanding why he wasn't at school anymore, having nightmares about someone hurting them the way Ethan had been hurt. The cumulative effect of these statements was to humanize Ethan beyond the crime scene photos and forensic testimony, reminding everyone in the courtroom that the victim had been a real child with relationships and potential, not just an abstract tragedy. The prosecution's sentencing argument, delivered by Nora Hughes, emphasized that the only appropriate sentence for Lucas's crime was life without possibility of parole. Hughes argued that Lucas had committed one of the most serious crimes imaginable, the premeditated murder of a defenseless child, and that his age at the time of the offense, while tragic, didn't eliminate his culpability. She pointed to the evidence of planning, the consciousness of guilt demonstrated by his attempted cover-up, and his lack of genuine remorse as factors weighing against leniency. Hughes acknowledged that sentencing a 14-year-old to life without parole was harsh, but argued that it was the only sentence that recognized the permanence of Ethan's death and the severity of Lucas's crime. She reminded Judge Chen that Lucas had demonstrated violence toward animals and other children before killing Ethan, suggesting a pattern that would likely continue if he were ever released. Defense attorney Sarah Mitchell's sentencing argument was an impassioned plea for mercy grounded in the unique circumstances of juvenile offenders. Mitchell cited Supreme Court precedent establishing that children are constitutionally different from adults for sentencing purposes, with greater capacity for rehabilitation and less culpability due to their developmental immaturity. She argued that sentencing Lucas to life without parole was tantamount to deciding that a 13-year-old was beyond redemption, a judgment that contradicted everything known about adolescent brain development and the potential for change. Mitchell presented evidence about successful rehabilitation programs for juvenile offenders, arguing that with intensive treatment for his mental illness and trauma, Lucas could potentially become a productive member of society. She urged Judge Chen to sentence Lucas to a term of years rather than life without parole, giving him at least the possibility of demonstrating rehabilitation and earning release as an adult. The revelation that Jacqueline Harrington had drafted blog content about Ethan's murder was revisited during the sentencing phase when defense attorney Mitchell argued it demonstrated the toxic environment that had shaped Lucas. Mitchell presented additional evidence showing that Jacqueline had continued to monetize family tragedy even after her arrest, starting a new blog called Shattered, A Mother's Journey Through Unimaginable Loss, where she positioned herself as a victim and expert on family violence. The new blog included sponsored content from therapy services and criminal defense attorneys, suggesting Jacqueline had learned nothing from her exploitation of Lucas's mental illness. Mitchell argued that a child raised by a mother who viewed tragedy as content to be monetized couldn't be judged by the same standards as a child raised in a normal, loving home. The argument was controversial, with some seeing it as a legitimate mitigating factor while others viewed it as an attempt to shift responsibility from Lucas to his mother. Judge Robert Chen's sentencing decision, announced on February 28, 2023, after hearing 2 full days of testimony and argument, was one of the most difficult of his 20-year judicial career. Chen acknowledged the compelling arguments on both sides, the prosecution's emphasis on the severity of the crime and the need for justice for Ethan, and the defense's emphasis on Lucas's age, mental illness, and abusive upbringing. The judge reviewed the evidence in detail, noting the premeditation demonstrated by the deleted searches, the brutality of the attack, the attempted cover-up, and Lucas's minimal remorse. But Chen also acknowledged Lucas's diagnosis with intermittent explosive disorder, the irresponsible decision to discontinue his medication, the modeling of violence by his father, and the exploitation by his mother. After carefully weighing all factors, Judge Chen concluded that the aggravating circumstances outweighed the mitigating ones and sentenced Lucas Lopez to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The announcement of the sentence sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. Lucas Lopez, at age 14, became the youngest person in Colorado history to be sentenced to life without parole, a distinction that immediately made his case a focal point for national debates about juvenile justice. Supporters wearing blue ribbons applauded the sentence, viewing it as appropriate accountability for a heinous crime. Supporters wearing green ribbons wept and shouted that the justice system had failed Lucas just as his parents had. Judge Chen explained his reasoning, stating that while he had great sympathy for Lucas's troubled upbringing, the deliberate planning of Ethan's murder and the consciousness of guilt demonstrated by the cover-up showed a level of culpability that warranted the maximum sentence. Chen also noted that Lucas would be housed in a juvenile facility until age 18, then transferred to adult prison, and would have access to mental health treatment throughout his incarceration. In the aftermath of Lucas's sentencing, the criminal cases against Marcus and Jacqueline Harrington proceeded to their own conclusions. Sheriff Marcus Harrington pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, child endangerment, and abuse of office, receiving a sentence of 15 years in prison. His law enforcement career was permanently over, his reputation destroyed, his pension forfeited. During his own sentencing hearing, Harrington took full responsibility for his failures, stating that he had prioritized his career and image over his children's welfare and that he deserved to be punished. He expressed hope that his imprisonment would serve as a warning to other parents that ignoring warning signs of violence in their children could have catastrophic consequences. Harrington also established a trust fund for Ethan's extended family using money from the sale of the family home, a gesture that some saw as genuine remorse, while others viewed as too little, too late. Jacqueline Harrington's case took a different trajectory. She initially pleaded not guilty to all charges, maintaining that she had been a victim of her husband's controlling behavior and that she'd done her best to care for both her sons. But faced with overwhelming evidence of her blog exploitation and the public's universal condemnation of her monetization of her son's tragedy, she eventually accepted a plea agreement. Jacqueline pleaded guilty to child abuse and neglect in exchange for the exploitation charges being dropped, receiving a sentence of 8 years in prison. As part of her plea agreement, she was required to permanently shut down all her blogs and social media platforms and to donate all revenue earned from content about Lucas or Ethan to a charity supporting victims of juvenile violence. The plea agreement sparked controversy, with victims' advocates arguing that the sentence was too lenient for a mother who had profited from her son's suffering while refusing to get him help. The Lucas Lopez case became a landmark in Colorado criminal justice history and sparked a statewide debate about juvenile sentencing reform. Advocacy groups used Lucas's case as an example of why life without parole sentences for juveniles should be abolished, arguing that condemning a 13-year-old to die in prison violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. They pointed to research on adolescent brain development, the potential for rehabilitation, and the disproportionate impact such sentences had on minority and mentally ill youth. But victims' rights organizations countered that some crimes, regardless of the perpetrator's age, were so heinous that the only appropriate response was permanent incarceration. They argued that Ethan Thompson's right to life had been permanently taken away and that Lucas's sentence simply reflected the permanence of his crime. The divided courtroom gallery, blue ribbons for Ethan, green ribbons for Lucas, became a symbol of the moral complexity surrounding juvenile justice. The blue ribbon supporters argued that sympathy for Lucas's youth and mental illness disrespected Ethan's memory and minimized the horror of fratricide. They organized events honoring Ethan's memory and advocating for stronger protections for children against family violence. The Green Ribbon supporters argued that condemning a mentally ill child to life in prison represented a failure of compassion and an abandonment of the principle that children are different from adults. They organized vigils outside the prison where Lucas was held and lobbied the state legislature to pass laws prohibiting life without parole sentences for offenders under age 14. The two groups rarely interacted, their opposing ribbons marking an ideological divide that reflected broader societal disagreements about punishment, redemption, and the nature of justice. Lucas Lopez's incarceration began in a juvenile facility designed for high-risk offenders, where he received intensive mental health treatment for his intermittent explosive disorder and trauma therapy to address his abusive upbringing. Reports from facility staff indicated that Lucas was a compliant inmate who participated in his treatment programs and showed signs of developing empathy and remorse that had been absent during his trial. His therapist noted that with proper medication and therapy, Lucas's explosive episodes had completely stopped, raising questions about what might have been different if he'd received this level of care before killing Ethan. But these positive reports did nothing to change his legal situation. Lucas would remain in juvenile custody until his 18th birthday in 2026, then be transferred to an adult maximum security prison where he would spend the rest of his life unless future courts or legislatures changed the law. The legacy of the Lucas Lopez case extended far beyond the courtroom. Millbrook, the affluent Aspen suburb where the tragedy had occurred, was forced to reckon with how its culture of image over substance had contributed to Ethan's death. Community members organized support groups for parents of children with mental illness, emphasizing the importance of seeking treatment rather than hiding problems to maintain reputations. Schools in the area implemented new protocols for identifying and reporting concerning behavior in students, training teachers to recognize warning signs of violence and to take threats seriously even when they came from wealthy, privileged families. The case also sparked changes in law enforcement culture, with Colorado implementing new policies requiring independent investigation of any incident involving a law enforcement officer or their family members. The final chapter of the Lucas Lopez case came when his appellate attorneys filed a challenge to his sentence with the Colorado Court of Appeals, arguing that life without parole for a 13-year-old violated evolving standards of decency and that Lucas's mental illness and abusive upbringing should have resulted in a lesser sentence. The appeal is pending as of late 2025, with both sides preparing extensive briefing on the constitutionality of extreme sentences for juvenile offenders. Legal experts are divided on how the court will rule, with some predicting the sentence will be upheld given the severity of the crime and the evidence of premeditation, while others believe the court will order resentencing based on Lucas's age and mental health status. Regardless of the outcome, the case has already ensured that Lucas Lopez's name will be remembered in legal history as a tragic example of what can happen when parental failures, systemic inadequacies, and untreated mental illness converge in a child's life. Ethan Thompson's legacy is preserved through a foundation established by his grandmother, Margaret, dedicated to protecting children from family violence and improving access to mental health treatment for troubled youth. The foundation advocates for Ethan's Law proposed state legislation that would require mandatory reporting and investigation of violent incidents involving juveniles, even when those incidents occur within law enforcement families. The foundation also funds scholarships for children who have lost siblings to violence, ensuring that Ethan's memory is associated with helping others rather than just with the tragedy of his death. In Aspen, a small park was renamed in Ethan's honor, with a playground featuring dinosaur sculptures reflecting his love of paleontology, a place where children can play safely, the childhood that was stolen from Ethan Thompson on March 15, 2022.